Dramatized adaptation. This is a retelling set in 1889, with the number of victims adjusted to fit the narrative focus. Many details are drawn from oral accounts and contested memories. What follows is a reconstruction, a legend shaped by evidence and silence. They laid the linen as if to seal a family name. The table at Boa Esperança was a map of lineage, porcelain from Lisbon and bunches of jasmine in earthenware, the silver arranged like a small ordered army, each fork and spoon reflecting the colonel's proud face. Children in white frocks clustered at one end, fingers sticky with sugar. The colonel's laughter warmed the room the way a hearth does. Padre Inácio, austere in his black band, moved through the house like someone who believed language could stitch bodies and souls together. This was a baptism meant to baptize more than a child's brow. It was a reaffirmation of a household that had survived wars and fortunes and wanted in this moment only to keep surviving. Outside, the river slid its slow light past the plantation's fence. A dog dozed under the shadow of a mango tree. Inside, the cook moved with the economy of someone whose hands had learned the language of every utensil, of every fire. Vittoria had arranged the roast, scooped the rice until it gleamed, set the platters as if she could fix a life by the steadiness of her palms. She had been in the house long enough to know exactly where the crumbs would gather, the exact note of the colonel's clearing throat when he claimed a victory or a son's blessing. She had been in the house long enough to know what silence the colonel wore at night. The first cry was impossibly not of pain but of surprise. A girl at the table, one of the colonel's nephews, put a hand to his throat and blinked, as if the air itself had become strange. A spoon clattered. The child's face grew pinched and small. Someone laughed, softly then thinly, before realizing it was not laughter at all. Another hand scrabbled at a glass. Then a woman, second cousin to the colonel, dropped the napkin she had been arranging. Her lips made an animal sound. The noise that followed was not yet a scream. It was the sound of things losing their names, silver hitting wood, a plate toppling, the quiet thump of a child's shoe as he slid from his chair. 2 minutes stretched and folded. 10 minutes and the house's rhythm was undone. Within the space of a single afternoon, 22 people around that table fell down. Not all of them dead at once, not all of them the same way, but struck as if by a fault line running through the colony of domestic order. Some gagged, some turned pale and fainted, some simply did not rise again. Nursing hands tried to lift sleepy heads. The metallic smell of panic was thin and bright in the mouth of those who watched. The jasmine on the table seemed suddenly obscene, as if it had known what would come and still perfumed the room. Word ran like a fever through the estate. The alpendre, usually reserved for polite talk, was filled with the sound of people who had been made strangers by shock. The colonel's face, which had been the color of old photographs, went hard. Padre Inácio murmured prayers. Someone banged at the kitchen door. The servants clustered in a way that made no sense until the count came, 22, and a number can rearrange a world. In a town that divided itself into those who owned and those who served, that afternoon rendered the divisions sudden, public, and cruelly equal in one respect. The fragile certainty that order prevailed had been torn open. If this story is gripping you, subscribe to the playlist of Hidden Memories, where we examine dramatized retellings of forgotten events. Boa Esperança looked at itself in that wound and saw history. The plantation was an island of neat hedges and wide verandas. Its rooms hung with portraits of men who had once been young and now appeared as if preserved by varnish. The colonel, Domingos Alves Branco, carried his authority as others carry clothes, with the comfort of a well-fitted coat. He spoke rarely of the law. Law at Boa Esperança was a thing that arrived in the face of a magistrate's seal or the colonel's negative glance. Donna Josefa moved like a sun through rooms, her voice gentle in the measured way of someone who knew patronage as kindness. Feitor Antonio, the overseer, walked with the stiffness of a man who believed the body could be bent into obedience. These were the elements of daily power. Vittoria's life could be read across the surfaces of the house. She woke before the dawn and made coffee in the iron pot, the steam a small liturgy. She polished the silver until the forks caught her own face back at her, a work-roughened mirror. She listened to the colonel's footsteps and learned, without being told, which must be acknowledged and what must be hidden. She carried the memory of her mother like a scar. Luanda had been a woman whose hands remembered the river's coolness and the rhythm of songs that kept grief steady. She had died in a way that never took shape in the official account. Some stories insisted she was struck by a beating beyond the house's modest explanation, called punishment for an offence the colonel named in tones so flinty people did not repeat them. Other versions claimed illness carried her off after a night of fever. Accounts vary, the older women would say. The truth hardened into rumour, and then into silence, which suited those who profited from not looking. João and Teresa were the names Vittoria never abandoned. Small and quick and given to sudden laughter, João with his knobby knees and Teresa with her hand in her mouth, they were taken from her in ways that history softened into terms like relocated or removed. Some said the children had been bartered away when the colonel's debts grew. Others said they had died of fever and been buried without ceremony. Vittoria's own remembrance was a compound of absence, their shoes in a corner, the way a small shirt still bore the smell of home. Loss in her life had been multiple and administrative. Pain had been rounded into bureaucratic language that made it smaller. The daily infringements were the mortar of her days. A hand lingered on her back with the presumption of ownership. A scolding voice corrected the angle at which she set a dish. Antonio, with his hands the colour of the earth, practiced a kind of habitual violence, words first, then gestures that left bruises ghosting across skin. He was not unseen. He was part of the furniture of the estate, the way a bell is part of the mourning. No one called him to account, because to call him was to call the system into question. The system existed in the small, unquestioned violences that compounded until they were weighty. Vittoria's rage, when it came to be named, had been stewed in slow fires. It was not sudden and blinding. It arrived as a certainty shaped by years. She moved through the house with a calm that was not peace. She observed, collected, recorded the injuries of a lifetime in the small ledger of the body. The cook's hands could prepare a feast with the same steadiness that they could count a household's losses. There were nights when she sat alone by the embers and turned her life as one turns over a pot to see what has been seared. The memory of Luanda's breathing failing, of João's quick laugh cut off, of Teresa's small hand slipping away, these attained a density that no apology could dissolve. In preparing for the baptism, Vittoria performed rituals both practical and private. She washed the hands of the housemaids until the collars gleamed. She laid the iced cakes in neat radiance. She sprinkled cinnamon over the rice. There were small choices: which flower to set at the head of the table, which platter to use for the colonel's portion. People noted her calmness as if it were simply the temperament of a seasoned worker. Only a few remembered other things: how she paused with a wooden spoon in the steam, how her eyes flickered at the sound of Padre Ignazio's arrival. There were whispers about an object found tucked away in the old chest under the stair, a powder kept in a folded scrap of cloth. The word powder moved through the town like an arrow that was never fully seen. Its composition and use never made the air of discussion, because no one wanted to speak of the means, only of the effect. In the stories, that scrap of cloth gathers different meanings: evidence, portent, luck, or proof. The narrative would later insist on detail or deny it, depending on who told it. On the day itself, she worked with the steadiness of someone who had learned to hold the hours together. She moved between the cooking fire and the dining room with the kind of attention that made servants invisible, an invisible architecture on which the house balanced. The feast was finished in ways that meant nothing to the broader public. The icing had the right gloss, the children's collars were starched, the colonel's napkin folded into sovereign geometry. No one watching could tell that the room carried an unspoken charge, the sort of low hum that precedes weather. When the first bodies stumbled, the house reacted in a choreography already known to those who served and to those who commanded. Hands flew to throats, the silver rang on the plates, someone overturned a chair in trying to get up. A child's shoe slid and made a sound like a small animal hurt. The sensory world narrowed to particulars: the cold weight of a plate in a palm, the refined scent of jasmine gone sour when mixed with fear, the taste of metal in mouths that were not yet ready to die. In the kitchen, Vittoria stood as if she had been struck. Some said she sank into a chair and held her face. Others reported she moved between bodies as if searching for a sign, as if she wanted to read the event like an open book. Different witnesses testified to different gestures. The truth of movement by movement could not be pinned down, because remembrances were colored by who the witness wished to see guilty. Doctors came from the town with black badges and neat hats, as if the world might be repaired by diagnosis. They bowed to the colonel, they coughed and tasted the air, and wrote notes in a hand that imagined itself detached. Their instruments did not cure the house of the suspicion that something intentional had happened. The imperative to find an author of the catastrophe was as urgent as the grief itself. In a community that prized order, a disaster like this demanded a culprit, for otherwise the narrative would have no end, and the colonel's lineage might be stained in ways that a seal could not repair. Rumors named many candidates. The overseer's rough temper put him near the center of suspicion for those who wanted to believe retribution came from within the family's circle. Others whispered of an enemy from a neighboring town, some foreign hand. But a finger soon pointed to the kitchen, where servants moved between the world of the elite and the world of the necessary. To accuse a servant is a tidy narrative for those who wish chaos to have a tidy face. In the weeks that followed, stories multiplied. One of the ways communities try to make meaning of catastrophe. Rosa's testimony would be decisive for the town, though not unambiguous. She was a washerwoman with eyes that remembered laundry and people with the same clarity she applied to stains. The accounts of her motives are not singular. In one telling, Rosa's family owed the colonel money, and she was promised relief for an accusation. In another, Rosa was frightened into testifying, scared that to resist was to invite suspicion and a worse fate. Some stories insist she had always disliked Vittoria, others that she bore a quiet compassion that could not save a friend from becoming a scapegoat. The multiplicity of motives matters. The drama of the trial depended less on absolute truth than on what the community needed to restore its certainties. The trial was a spectacle, the square filled with faces that wanted to watch how order would be restored. Men and women came, some with a hunger for righteous vengeance, some simply curious in the same way neighbors come to watch a tree being cut down after a storm. Judges, magistrates, men in sober coats took their places as if to put a scaffold of legality around chaos. The legal language was careful, almost clinical. It spoke of bodies and counts, of culpability and evidence, but it often avoided the broader question, why had such a crime become thinkable in the soil of this plantation? Instead, the court offered a story that could be easily read. A servant had committed murder, and thus order could be re-established by punishment. Witnesses lined up. Some told lengthy accounts of seeing Vittoria near the serving platters. Others who had been in the house gave statements that spared her any proximity. A doctor described the hurried efforts in the Alpendre, the attempts to rouse the fallen. Antigua women whispered about Luanda's fate. The presiding men nodded as if these were facts delivered from a higher region. Yet behind the formal statements lay a tangle of confidences. Rosa's hesitance in the witness chair, a neighbor's late recollection linked to a rumor, a servant who changed his testimony when a purse slipped into his hand. The court became a theater in which the town's need to single out an author was met with persuasive force. Vittoria's defense, to the extent the record allowed, was not a speech that could exonerate the world of its structures. Her words were said to be few. Some said she replied only to questions, making no long explanation. Others claimed she confessed to bearing responsibility in a way that sounded like accusation rather than contrition. Accounts vary, as they must, because memory and politics do not record with the same ink. What is certain is that the trial was less an attempt to interrogate structural violence than an attempt to place the blame on a single leaf so the tree could appear intact. Public trials in that landscape serve another purpose. They reteach a community how to behave. Spectators learn what is permissible and what is intolerable. Punishment becomes pedagogy. The court's verdict carried with it the power to re-establish a narrative that assured those with power that catastrophe need not threaten their rule. Vittoria's fate was sealed in a language that made sense to those who believed the house's hierarchy eternal. The day of execution gathered the town as an observatory of a lesson. Carts and wagons creaked to the square. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see what adults had decided they should see. Those who had lost kin sat like raw edges in the crowd, their faces a map of mourning. The colonel arrived with a small retinue, his expression the one of a man convinced that preserving a line requires one to enact a judgment that seems to close the wound. Padre Ignazio, bound to the rituals of order, read scripture with a voice that might have tried to bend grace into an explanation. Vittoria walked as if she had already rehearsed what it meant to face a world that had not given her justice. She climbed the platform and stood with a posture that did not plead. When asked for last words, different accounts offer different final acts. Some say she spoke a long confession, others a defiant soliloquy, others that she whispered only a single phrase before the engines of the day closed. What travelled outwards, carried by mouths and retold like grain, was not direct transcription but a paraphrase that settled into truth by repetition. People said she accused the system itself. The words attributed to her, reported and reshaped by retellings, were less a legal claim than an indictment, a voice that argued not for personal exoneration, but for a naming of cause. It was said, reported in many versions, that Vittoria declared in words paraphrased by those who would carry them, that it was the system that had murdered generations, and that, in her act, she had answered for 22 lives. Those words, however, they were exactly formed, became a lens through which the countryside passed the event. To many they were blasphemous, to others they were a bitter truth spoken aloud. But whether she intended to explain, to accuse, or to console, what she did with her final words was convert a private act into a public allegory. She refused the neat role assigned to her, a villain to be excised, and instead offered herself as a mirror reflecting what a long history of humiliation had borne. The execution ended the immediate drama, but not the story. The colonel's household tightened its rules. Locks were changed, servants' movements monitored with new suspicion. It is one of the ironies of such events. Punitive measures reinforced the very scaffolding that made the tragedy possible. For the town, life resumed its measured course even as stories of that afternoon persisted. In the cenzalas and among women folding laundry, the narrative remained alive in whispers, every telling a slight variation that made the legend more porous than the official record. Legacy in such moments takes many forms. Official registers condensed the catastrophe into the sterile categories of crime and punishment. They listed names, dates, the outcome of trials. Paper resists nuance. Yet oral memory kept different things alive. The feeling of a mother's hand no longer on a child's hair, the way the jasmine smelled before the collapse, the image of a single woman on a platform who turned an execution into accusation. Children were told cautionary tales, some to warn them against imitating what was labeled evil, others to teach them to remember the wrongs that had been done. Songs circulated in low voices. Some families left the region, others stayed and found new ways of guarding themselves. Over time, the story acquired ribbons of folklore. Some versions made Vittoria monstrous, others made her tragic and saintly. Those who benefited from the structure emphasized the clarity of the verdict and the necessity of punishment. Those who bore the bruise of powerlessness remembered the injustice differently, as an outcry that named the wound. It is a characteristic of legends to be elastic. They are stretched by those who need them to be proof, and shortened by those who need them to be forgotten. In remote corners of the region, the name Boa Esperança became a shorthand for both cruelty and the persistence of memory. What happens to public memory after such a day is instructive. The colonel's file in the magistrate's office reads like the rest of the town's administrative life. Clean, factual, lacking the texture of grief. Historians looking backward find a ledger that shows a crime and its consequence. Oral historians, on the other hand, encounter a living archive of contradiction. Stories insisted that Luanda's death had been violent. Other people insisted otherwise. Stories insisted that João and Teresa had been taken. Others insisted they had died of fever. In the gaps, people placed moral weight. Who is allowed to tell the story, and which version will become the one taught to children? These are not mere differences of detail. They are the architecture of memory and power. The question asked afterward, was it justice, crime, or the desperate scream of a person pressed beyond endurance, refuses a tidy answer. To call Vittoria a murderer is to look only at an act outside its context. To call her a martyr is to obscure the real harm of lives lost. To ask whether punishment alone restores a social wound is to ignore how punishment can be a performance that hides structural failure. The town's eagerness to find a single author was, perhaps, an attempt to avoid the heavier work of changing a world where servants' bodies are legible as instruments of order. In small ways the place changed. Locks and windows were reinforced. The colonel's family intensified displays of piety and public charity to smooth the moral roughness left behind. Servants grew more guarded in their talk. Children were kept closer. Tradesmen who had been at the feast told the story with different emphases, and travellers carried those versions outward. At night, the women who had been alive that day told their children stories that sometimes began with names and sometimes ended with a question. The legend grew teeth and also the capacity to confuse. In the years that followed, songs and proverbs borrowed from the event. The phrase answered for 22 lives entered ordinary speech in some quarters, sometimes used to describe acts of disproportionate reprisal, sometimes invoked with sarcastic bitterness at the state's own abuses. Where written records overlooked nuance, the oral tradition preserved it. Someone would always remember that Rosa's testimony had been condemned by some as coerced. Someone would always recall that Padre Ignazio had wept, or not. Someone would insist Luanda had not been sick when she died. The multiplicity of these recollections became both a wound and an education, every memory a contested claim on what had become of the past. The town's public face, however, preferred a clean narrative. There was crime, there was punishment, and order returned. That neatness is easier for institutions to live with. It is more comfortable to believe that a single criminal, executed, closes the moral ledger. But those who lived in the shadow of the plantation knew otherwise. They knew that structures of humiliation survived through domesticated rituals and private violences that go unremarked because the law speaks in terms that do not measure a life's indignities. Vittoria's portrait, where it exists in memory, is a mixture of worn dignity and inscrutability. She is sometimes rendered monstrous, and sometimes as a figure who named a truth that others refused to countenance. That the story can hold both is precisely what makes it a subject of restless conversation. It forces those who listen to decide which truths they are willing to carry. It asks whether punishment can ever be a substitute for reckoning, the sort that remakes institutions and reparations that address the lineage of harms. When people today tell the story, they often begin with the breakfast table and the porcelain that could not prevent the falling. They end with a question that is older than the house. How does a community reconcile the violence it needs to maintain itself with the suffering that violence produces? Is a single body's execution a closure or a continuation, dressed differently? These are not easy questions. They demand a willingness to sit with discomfort and with the ambiguity that belongs to human affairs. For those who inherit the story, the memory can be a prompt to look closer, not only at the dramatic afternoon, but at the slow measures of humiliation that preceded it. Who is allowed to speak? Who is allowed to own? What are the ways a society distributes dignity and denies it? The history of Boa Esperança teaches that an official ledger is not the only archive. The stories told by women in kitchens, by children daring to ask about missing names, by singers who carry a line of melody, preserve a different truth. In those hidden memories, justice is more complicated than a sentence. It is a remaking of relations. There are many versions of the last speech attributed to Vittoria. Some recall it as a single line, others as a staccato of protests. What holds across the versions is that she did not accept being reduced to the crime alone. She turned, with what seemed like intent, the indictment outward. She made her last words less a private plea than a public accusation, that the thing which had killed generations was not a person, but a system, and that in her act she had answered, in however limited a manner, for those 22 lives. Whether she sought to be judged as an avenger, a lunatic, a saint, or merely a person exhausted by possibility, we cannot say with certainty. The retelling of her words carries a double burden, the repetition of the phrase and the community's own need to interpret it. We close, then, with the fact of uncertainty, which is often the only honest place to end. This is a dramatized adaptation of events from 1889, reshaped by oral tradition and selective record. The number 22 is the figure that this telling insists upon, The year is the stage upon which this narrative is set. Many details remain contested. Many witnesses remembered differently. The point of retelling is not to render a final verdict, but to lay out the complexities that a single headline erases. Was it justice, crime, or desperation? The question stands as an invitation and as a challenge. If you have followed this story, if it leaves you unsettled or clear, leave your mark, comment 22, and tell us what you think this event reveals about the ways societies distribute blame and bear responsibility. If you wish to hear more dramatized retellings of hidden memories like this one, follow the playlist for the next story.